All right. Give it a couple more minutes. I'm sure some more people are joining. There we go. Wonderful. Wonderful. Excellent. I'm sure we've got people from all over the country. Love to get a sense of where everyone's coming from. Please feel free, don't be shy to comment in the comments. We'll give it another minute or so for the ever-present stragglers, those that are stuck at the clinic, wrapping up. All right. Well, thank you, attendees, for joining, for taking the time to attend this webinar to discuss something that I frankly believe is not talked about a lot. It's really not discussed much, especially in the day-to-day operation of your veterinary clinic. It's not something that frequently pops up in mind, but of course, the issue is the moment there is an issue, it becomes a very significant issue. It becomes the most pressing issues that can arise in any veterinary clinic, and that's the office lease. And so, of course, we're here today to discuss what, first of all, what is a lease? Second of all, why is it impactful to you? What you should really look out for in your lease? What it should do for you, what it should not do for you, or rather, what can be detrimental to you in the office lease, to your plans for a clinic, to build a clinic, to renew your lease, for managing your overheads, and of course for the ever, the possibility of transition going forward here. The lease has a very significant role to play in this. I do want to launch a poll to get a sense of where everyone's at as far as their particular situation. Please feel free to answer while I begin launching the main body of the lease. So just trying to get a raise of hands here. Who here today uh, owns their own real estate versus leasing a space? If you can answer in the polls there, that'd be appreciated. It'll help tune the conversation for me as well going forward here. So for those that don't know, my name is Jason Yim. I'm the team lead at Cirrus Consulting Group. We're North America's preeminent office lease negotiation firm for veterinarians. We also work with medical professionals and dentists. And the reason why we exist is, to me, it's quite interesting. We actually got started over 30 years ago now. It was a group of doctors that started us. Simply put, they were tired of being pushed around by their landlord. And so they got together with real estate professionals to form Cirrus because really the issue was they were deciding who's really got their back as far as the lease. Who can they really rely on to look out for their best interests? So Cirrus, what we do is we're not a brokerage. We exclusively specialize, again, in the office lease for the veterinarian community, the medical community, and the dental community. And this is all we do, day in and day out. So I'll be showing a couple of data points here. Take it with a grain of salt, everyone. They may not be representative of your particular area, but they'll help illustrate exactly what we're looking at and what you should be looking at when you're determining what to do with your office lease and where your office lease sits and where your rent sits in relation to everyone else in the market. So most commonly, when we're discussing an office lease, the first thing to think about is, well, what am I paying? And certainly this is a very important facet to the lease, but I do want to point out that the rental portion of your lease really only represents 2 or 3 pages in that 50-page document. There's a lot more to go through. Although, of course, for the landlord's consideration, for your consideration, before you sign a lease, you're gonna definitely want to know where your lease sits in regards to the rest of the market. On top of that, to get a better understanding of the opportunity cost for the landlord for yourself, it's also important to pay attention to the vacancy rate in an area. Effectively, if you were to leave a space or if you were to not consider a space to build out your practice today at, what other opportunities are out there in your respective area? The vacancy rate will have a huge role to play in that. Other things we'd want to look out for when we're determining really what's at stake, what's the market conditions like when it comes to your lease, are various other items such as net absorption, how much is on the market versus how much is actually getting leased out. We don't want to pay attention to, especially for those in larger urban areas, we'd want to pay attention to the age of the building, the landlord situation. Is it an individual? Is it an investment group, a REIT that owns the building? These are all important considerations that the landlord will be taking in before they decide what to present to you in your lease agreement, but also important to you. It'll help steer your ship as far as if you want to pursue an opportunity at this particular space or not. Now, as I alluded to, the biggest thing to think about is, well, what really is a lease? And more often than not, what people think about is, well, it's $20 a square foot, it's $30 a square foot. I'm going to be paying for 5 or 10 years. But let's take a step back here, is what I'm going to suggest. Because although, yes, the face rate, the rate that you would be paying per square foot may be represented by 20 or $30 a square foot or $50 a square foot, whatever the case may be. But what your landlord is thinking about, and what I encourage you also to think about before you sign a lease agreement, is in fact that when you sign a lease agreement over a 30-year span, for as long as the clinic is in a space, what this really represents is a $2 million plus paycheck to the landlord. So there's a $2 million commitment on your end as well. So it's quite important to, frankly, read through the lease, get an understanding of what your obligations are, what flexibility you have in the lease, and potentially any exposure you have before you sign this large agreement. Now, I do want to touch on, of course, the financial component of the lease agreement because, well, as I mentioned, it is the first 3 pages, although they are indeed very significant to your overhead expenses, come renewal, your overhead expenses for the next 10, 15, 20 years potentially. For those that are looking to potentially transition and sell, this represents the overhead for your potential buyer as well. So that's something they'll be taking into consideration when they're looking at your lease agreement before they buy your practice. And certainly base rent is one of the key ones that we want to look at when we dive into any kind of lease negotiation. But realistically, there's 7 key financial variables that you really should be paying attention to, especially if you're doing a new build or if you're planning to expand. So what we'd want to touch on is certainly your base rent, of course, as I mentioned before, but quite commonly missed, I find, is your common area maintenance. What that means is your additional expenses when it comes to operating the building. So, for example, for those that are in a shopping plaza, what this can represent is the garbage disposal. It can represent snow removal for those in the north. It can represent security, landscaping, maintenance to the roof, all those things. As a tenant, you would have to pay for, or at least your portion of that. So, what I mean by that is typically if you have 10,000 square feet in the given plaza and you take up 2,000 square feet, that means you would be paying 20% of that share of maintenance. What can you do about that? Well, frankly, there's a ton on the table. We're not saying that, of course, you're going to be negotiating against the garbage disposal company for a lower rate, but one of the key things that we can dial in on is how much exactly you're supposed to be paying throughout the year. On top of that, getting extra accountability as far as what you're paying. will be important. More often than not, what I find with my doctors is that they get a statement at the end of the year, the landlord's indicating that they should top up their common area maintenance. Reconciliation statement is what they call it. And more often than not, this represents several $1,000s of topping up. Having additional clarity as far as what you're topping up, what you're paying for, can be beneficial to you in case you believe something is suspicious. For those that are thinking about doing a new build or an expansion of the clinic, what can be very useful is getting a free rent period. And free rent period and fixturing period, we can lump those two kind of together because free rent represents you signing a lease, and then as let's call it an added bonus, you would have a couple of months of free rent on top. Now, before you build out your clinic, for those that are looking to build a clinic, or for those that are thinking to expand the adjacent space, that type of thing, I'm going to make the distinction here because what we believe is that, well, certainly, if you're going to build out a clinic, you will need time to build out your clinic. And as a result, it's our belief that you should have that time rent free because just like other medical professions, veterinarians are absolutely the best tenant on the planet. Simply put, COVID proof, you can't work from home. It's hard for you to leave, especially with build out costs of 200, $250, $350 a square foot. It's not easy to pick up the practice and go somewhere else. And the average time that a clinic, like a vet clinic, stays in a space is approximately 26 and a half years. So the opportunity for the landlord is quite significant. They want to keep you. They want to keep you in that space. And it certainly doesn't hurt to say, look, our intention is to build here for at least 10 years and stay here for 10, 20, 30 years. Can we get a little bit of assistance while we're in that build process? On top of that, you'll see that we'd want to touch on annual increases. So your annual increases are how much your rent increases annually. Self-explanatory, but I do want to emphasize that, as I mentioned, over a 30-year span, although you may be paying $20 a square foot and it's a 2,000 square foot space, you'll be easily making a commitment of $2 million plus over the next 20, 30 years. And how much your rent increases per year will have a very significant impact to that at the end of the day. So we want to be able to make sure that, simply put, in layman's terms, you're not getting gouged on your increases, but we want to make sure that your rent is approximately in line with the rest of the market. This will be absolutely very significant as well when it comes to any eventual transition. Your potential buyer of the clinic will also be looking at your base rent and how much the rent will be over the next 10, 15, 20 years prior to making that investment into buying your clinic. So again, very important to note. So for those that are thinking to expand or build something or even renovate their space, frankly, this next one can be very significant. And it's called tenant improvement allowance, or colloquially known as TI. So what this represents is effectively, what it sounds like is the landlord will provide you money to help build out the space or renovate the space. I do want to emphasize caution with this particular line though, because what we do find is, well, let's put it this way. We understand what the landlord's business is. The landlord's business is to provide you a space. It's to give you a space in their plaza, in the professional building to build out your vet clinic. Their business is not to give you a loan. Their business is not to give you money. So it's important to be not necessarily suspicious, but be cautious with taking tenant improvement allowance because it's important to think about, well, if they're not responsible for loaning me money, where are they getting the money from? I see the question in the comments, and I can certainly answer the question. It's a really good question. I will be answering the questions at the end of the webinar, but excellent question to ask. Now, I do also want to talk about tenant improvement allowance being it's quite important to take tenant improvement allowance sometimes, depending on what the bank has uh, approved you on as far as your loan. It may be very beneficial, but it's important to exercise caution because what happens more often than not is, in one hand, the landlord may give it, but in the other hand, the landlord may take it away. Typically, what happens is the landlord will increase your rent as a result of taking that $50 a square foot in tenant improvement allowance. I've seen as high as $100 a square foot in tenant improvement allowance. So important to exercise caution here. Now, another benefit for those that are thinking to do renos or if the space needs some work is the next one. It's called landlord work. And simply put, it's the landlord paying for the improvements in your space. That's a very neat one for us to negotiate. I had one recently where, in exchange for securing a 10-year term with the landlord, the doctor got in exchange for that they got the landlord to replace the $20,000 air conditioning unit. So I would definitely suggest that's a significant win for the doctor. There's a number of ways to get a financial win out of your lease. But of course, for some people, leasing a space may not be where their head is at when it comes to building out their space. They may instead want to purchase a building or build a building from the ground up. Depending on your area, that might be the only viable option is to build a building. You know, although we're a leasing firm, a lease negotiation firm, we're not going to knock buying a property. It really depends on your particular area. But it's important to note what's at stake when you're buying a building. What are the pros and cons? And certainly, one of the pros is, well, there's certainly no lease negotiation. You'll be your own landlord. You get to decide. You'll get to decide exactly what you want to do with the property, how you paint the walls, how many floors you want to have in the building, as long as you get the correct permits. A lot of people will indicate to me that they will want to keep the building as a passive form of income when they transition as well. Of course, the most significant barrier is the upfront cost, especially for those that are thinking to build a practice, having to spend $2 or $3 million to acquire the land and buy the building, and then having to spend $1 million plus to build out the space and then equip it. That's no small amount of change. So it's important to decide if leasing a space will provide you a better opportunity. And certainly it can, because more often than not, lease spaces are in heavily traveled areas. It can be the space that's beside the Kroger or the Trader Joe's that you'd be leasing. So you'll see a lot more foot traffic. On top of that, because you don't have to buy a building, you have greater capital to put towards nicer equipment or nicer furnishings for your build out. You also have, frankly, greater flexibility to expand or relocate. A big one that I think about is sometimes people have a desire to build a larger size clinic, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 square foot. And if you're buying a building, a lot of the time you'd have to buy that 5,000 square foot building right off the bat, rather than in a leasing scenario where you could potentially lease 2,000 square foot up front and have what we call a right of first refusal to take on an adjacent space where, let's say that the hair salon beside you decide to leave. Now you have the opportunity to expand at your leisure. So, the emphasis here is, let's say you don't necessarily have to bite off more than you can chew, especially in a leasing scenario. It allows you to control that cash flow out of the clinic. So now, of course, as I mentioned, buying real estate or leasing real estate, I'm not saying one's better than the other, but it's just important to note what is the true opportunity cost. I always advise our doctors to not necessarily think about buying or leasing so much as what is the best option for my clinic? Is it a better option for my clinic to own the real estate? Does it allow me to do what I want with the space? Are you going to be paying yourself rent? How much are you going to be paying yourself rent? If I purchase this building and do the build, will I have a very significant loan over the next 5 or 10 years where the building doesn't cash flow? What liability do you have if you purchase the building? Do you have a corporation set up for the building to hold the building? It's always advisable to move the building to a corporation rather than owning it personally or through the vet corp. And part of this is liability, part of this is taxation, part of this is what if you want to sell the clinic? Does the building go with the clinic? Can the buyer afford the vet clinic and the building at the same time? It's better to have a separation for the what ifs. And similarly for leasing, there's really important pieces to consider here. For those that are leasing or for those that are looking to acquire a clinic, to build a clinic in a lease space, really important to note, when does the lease expire? Because the biggest thing is that lease agreement, it's a contractual obligation to stay in a space and to pay a certain amount of rent. So before you effectively pull the trigger on leasing a space or acquiring a clinic, it's important to know, well, realistically, how much time do I have if I buy a clinic or if I lease a space to be in that space? What's the opportunity for me to stay longer? The big one there is how many options do I have to renew? And what's the deadline for that? When do I need to tell the landlord that I'm going to stay? Also, really important to note here is for either case, frankly, is when you want to transition or sell. That'll help steer the ship as far as what you need to look out for in your own lease agreement, getting additional clarity as far as what's the future of the building, whether you're the landlord or you have a landlord. If you have a landlord, one of the significant ones, of course, is going to be number seven. Does your landlord have a demolition right or a relocation right? Can the clinic somehow be forcefully removed from the space so that the landlord can develop a condo or a new shopping plaza? Or I've had this happen. If your landlord decides to relocate your clinic from the end cap to the middle of the plaza because a very significant anchor tenant wanted the end cap unit. These are things that we'd want to look out for in the lease agreement. Either in your own lease agreement where you own the building or if you are leasing a space. Now, as far as for those that are thinking about a eventual transition, and I hope for all of you, you can all retire when you want to. These are going to be really important parts to the value of your clinic at the end of the day. So certainly, if you talk to any practice evaluator, they'll tell you, look, we're going to take a look at and value your equipment. We're going to see if they're updated. Do you have new equipment? Do you have equipment from the 80s? How's the state of repair of your various air compressors and vacuums and so on. They're also going to take a look at your goodwill. Has it been growing year on year? But what we found is even more significant than either of those by themselves is in fact the lease. Because simply put, what's the value of the clinic without the keys? So it's really important to note that the lease plays a very significant value to not just the getting into a space and getting into ownership, not just about building a space and what you're going to pay day one when you decide to open the doors, but 30 years down the line when you want to sell, what's that going to look like for you? Now, as I mentioned, we want to take a look at the lease a little bit differently. It's not solely about the rent you pay, but it realistically, it should provide you fair and affordable financial terms. What we'd want to aim for is having the lease be national as a national average. It's about 8%, 8.32% is the number we use for your tenancy compared to your overall production. Having a lower number in this regard, of course, is favorable. If you can have a clinic that achieves a tenancy expense of 4, 3, or 2% of your overall production, kudos to you. And when it comes to any lease renewals or expansion plays, especially if you're looking to eventually sell your clinic, maintaining a lower number is absolutely to your benefit and to your buyer's benefit. We want to make sure that you can do that. Of course, as I mentioned before, landlords are looking for two things. They're looking for how much you're paying, but they also want to look at your term, how long you're staying. And frankly, most of our doctors are also looking for the same thing. They want to make sure that if they do spend that 250 a square foot, that $500,000, that $1 million to build out their space or to acquire a clinic for that matter, they want to make sure that they can stay there for as long as possible and that there's as minimal disruption as possible. So the lease can either be very beneficial to that or it can be quite detrimental to that. So it's important to take a look at that. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that the various risks that can be within a lease, both in terms of any of the financial pieces or the business clauses of the lease, those are minimized. On top of that, quite commonly, the lease can also expose you personally to various risks in the lease agreement as well. So we want to make sure that those are managed as much as possible and minimized as much as possible. On top of that, the lease, I think I mentioned it before, it really should provide you some degree of flexibility as far as where you take your clinic. What I mean by that is, do you have the ability to expand if business is booming? Or if it's not, what's the opportunity to leave? Is there any cost associated to leave? When you want to sell your clinic, do you have the ability to sell your clinic? Do you have the ability to transfer your lease? That's a really big one that we've been seeing more and more throughout the country as a lot of doctors are unfortunately having disrupted transition plans because of the stupid lease. So what we want to do is maximize your opportunity here. And as I mentioned, the ability to sell plays a huge role in that, both in terms of your ability to effectively transfer the keys to your buyer, but it can also affect, well, how much you get at the end of the day in the eventual sale. So we're a little bit past halfway through, guys, this webinar. So I figured, you know what, we're just going to touch on all these. No, I'm just kidding, guys. There's a lot in in a lease agreement that we can certainly work on, but the key emphasis for this webinar is to emphasize that it's not just your base rent. It's not just how much you're paying year on year. There's an absolute ton of language, business clauses, we call it, within your lease agreement that can be quite detrimental to the value of your clinic, or it can be extremely beneficial, absolutely beneficial to you. And it's a matter of negotiating properly to make sure that you get the best of both worlds. Things like the alterations language. Do you have the ability to alter your space? Do you have the ability to add that X-ray that you want in a particular room? Do you have the ability to cut the floor and add plumbing if you need? Can you add that kennel space? How long do you have to build? Things like your ability to transfer in the assignment language. Does the landlord have the ability to demolish the space, as I mentioned before? Other beneficial pieces that can be added into your lease agreement can be death and disability clauses for you, effectively a free life insurance policy, let's call it, in case something were to occur. Personal guarantees are quite significant in lease agreements. As I mentioned before, you may personally be liable under this lease. So, it's a good opportunity when you're negotiating the lease to limit that as much as possible. Exclusivity is something that many doctors look to aim for. And it certainly doesn't hurt when you're contractually obligated, let's say, to be the only vet clinic in a given plaza or in a given complex of buildings. So one of the significant ones, as I touched on, is the demolition clause. And for those, especially in larger city centers, I've been seeing this more and more frequently. This is quite common in, for example, New York, California, anywhere in California for that matter. But we've definitely been seeing it in the Pacific Northwest, in Florida, in Texas, any of the bigger city centers. This is very significant. And effectively, what this does is it allows the landlord to tell you, look, I have intention to demolish the plaza or materially alter the project, i.e., it doesn't have to be a full demolition of the building. It could mean we're going to substantially renovate the building. We're going to add a second floor. We're going to add a third floor. I need you to leave because your clinic is in the way of this particular plan now. What they'll also tell you is that they can terminate your lease and they're only going to give you 180 days notice. Now, what this what this means effectively is you have 180 days to find a new space and build it out. I haven't seen any clinics, I haven't seen any doctors successfully find a new space, completely build it out within 180 days, especially when this comes as a surprise. That's the biggest thing. So, what we'd want to do, given this scenario, is absolutely buy you as much time as possible. The last thing we want is to have something like this completely blindside you when you're in the midst of practicing, 5 years into your lease or 15 years into your lease. On top of that, there can be, in many instances, other language here with that the landlord may add into the demolition clause, whereby they only compensate you for a certain, usually quite a small amount of money in exchange for effectively kicking you out. They may ask for, they may say that they're only going to provide you a an amount that's equal to the unamortized portion of the cost to the tenant. Basically, you know, they'll indicate that they're going to pay for some leasehold improvements, the value of your current leasehold improvements while you're leaving. But realistically, $250 a square foot, $300 a square foot, if you're facing that for your next build in the plaza down the street, that current landlord will typically not nearly pay you enough to cover that. And what does this mean at the end of the day? Well, frankly, the cost of not paying attention to this type of language means, especially at time of sale, this could mean $250,000 up to a $750,000 loss in the value of your clinic. Because what this means to your potential buyer is there's no security for them when it comes to signing your lease. More often than not, when we talk to, the likes of the big banks, they absolutely hate seeing this type of language in a lease as well because it provides them no security. It provides their underwriters no security to provide the loan to the buyer. So it's a very significant issue. And frankly, there is a way out. It's to negotiate the lease, to negotiate this line completely out of the lease or to amend it heavily where if nothing else, you get more notice, but what can also be beneficial is adding language where the landlord may effectively pay you more to leave a space. We had an interesting one quite recently where the landlord had intention to uh, expropriate, transfer the land to the municipality so that they could build a subway. And interestingly, the language of the lease did not allow for the landlord to boot the doctor out of the space. So as a consequence, there was a settlement that we had helped negotiate where the doctor was paid $1 million to effectively not stay in that space. So the benefit of having, or excuse me, not having a demolition clause, it cannot be stressed enough. Now, of course, if you are buying a clinic or you're building a space, building a clinic out where there is a demolition clause or it's being discussed, it's not the end of the world. It's absolutely not the end of the world. There's a number of ways you can move around it, and it's really worthwhile to explore negotiation discussion uh, with the landlord to see, well, how far can we push it? How much of the lemon can we squeeze? So I do want to touch on another quite significant one, especially for those that are thinking to acquire a clinic or to transition out, and it's the assignment. Basically, if you're looking to sell a clinic or buy a clinic, you need to ask the landlord to transfer you the keys. It's their space, it's their business. They want to know who's going to be operating out of the space. That's completely reasonable. They want to know. They want to know if you're going to be responsible. They want to know if you can handle the rent. And the first thing that they'll ask you to do is ask them. It specifically says it here. This is a very typical uh, assignment clause that we see. And they'll ask that you need to ask them. After that point, what will typically happen is that they'll need to consider saying yes, number one. They may consider to say no, depending on the situation. For example, if your buyer has insufficient credit, insufficient funds, their bad history of business ownership, etc., that might be in their consideration. The third that does pop up, and frankly, in our opinion, it's outrageous, is that the landlord may opt to completely terminate the lease. So what that means is if you're the clinician and you're indicating to the landlord, look, I want to transfer to Dr. A, I'm selling the clinic, the landlord with this line, they're not necessarily obligated to say yes. In fact, they may look to cut you out of the picture. They may look to terminate your lease and deal with Dr. A directly. Why would they do this? Well, especially if you've gotten a fantastic deal regarding your rent, this might be a really good opportunity for the landlord to deal with the new doctor, bump up the rent, have that doctor avoid paying you for your clinic and effectively cut you out. They like this is typically not a malicious action when in the eyes of the landlord. What they're doing is they're looking to improve their position. They're looking to improve their bottom line. But simply put, it's absolutely outrageous. It's not designed for any kind of veterinary clinic, medical clinic, dental clinic, not whatsoever. This is much more designed for the Mexican restaurant. It's designed for the clothing store. We believe that this really shouldn't be in the lease. Furthermore, what we find frequently is that, like, you got to remember, it's the landlord's space, and as a result, the landlord may reserve the right to increase the rent as part of the assignment, i.e., you were paying $20 a square foot, but for Dr. A, they're going to be paying 25. That's closer to market now. What effect does that have on you? Well, if you're the seller, you may see a detriment to the value of your clinic. Dr. A may say, hey, I was planning to buy your clinic. I was expecting to pay $20 a square foot. I wasn't expecting to pay 20% more in rent, 25% more in rent over the next 10 years. I want a discount on your practice. If you're buying the clinic, this is quite significant as well because, well, you're about to hand over a significant lump lump of money to the seller of the clinic. You're going to be handing over a million, million and a half, 2 million, 3 million, whatever the case is. The last thing you want is to see a significant increase in your rent. As a result, you're looking to reduce your overheads as much as possible when you're coming in. So either way, it's quite significant. But one of the most impactful ones, especially for the selling doctor, is what we call consideration, i.e., to consider transferring the lease, in consideration for transferring the lease. You, the tenant, if you receive anything from your assignee, from your buyer, in the form of rental income, cash goods, etc., that difference between your amount that you're paid compared to your rent shall be paid to the landlord. What I mean by that is, in layman's terms, if a clinic is being sold for $1 million, in consideration for transferring the lease, if the rent for the clinic is $100,000 a year, there is a difference of 900,000, and the landlord may ask for at least some portion of that $900,000 as consideration for transferring the lease. I get it. It sounds completely incredible. It sounds incredible that they could even ask for that. And in the eyes of the landlord, it's completely reasonable because what they're saying is, look, you're part of the success of your clinic is my space. It's my foot traffic. You're stationed beside the Kroger, you're stationed beside the Trader Joe's, Walmart. You got excellent foot traffic because you're here. It's my space. You wanted the nice windows, you wanted the end cap, fantastic parking. It's my space. That $1 million, I respect that value. Some of the value is attributed to the goodwill and equipment, but some of that should belong to me. It's my space. Now, of course, we certainly at Cirrus, we don't believe that whatsoever. We fully believe that if you were to pick up and leave and build a clinic elsewhere, you're going to run a successful clinic, whether you're in this particular space or in space B. This particular line, again, a lot of leases are written not with vets in mind. They're designed for the Trader Joe's of the world. They're designed for the Starbucks of the world, the cafes and the grocery stores. And we don't believe that this type of line should belong in any, vet specific lease. No, not whatsoever. The kicker as well is the very last line. It indicates notwithstanding the landlord's consent to any assignment or subletting, the tenant shall not be released from its obligation under the lease and shall remain liable for any future, failure of the tenant or its assignees. So effectively, what that means is, although you, the selling doctor, may have transferred the lease, you're sitting in Palm Beach and you're relaxing. If something happens to your buyer, effectively the landlord can give you a call and say, well, something's happened here, doctor. Unfortunately, the buyer's defaulted on the lease. They haven't paid me for 3 months. I can't find them. I need you to come back. And it's really unfortunate when that happens. We had that happen to a doctor in let's call it the Midwest, where it was exactly that. It was a doctor that sat in one of our CE courses, and we went through this line, and they raised their hand and said, "Well, unfortunately, this happened to me. I got a call 3 years after I sold the clinic, and they had to stay there. You had to rehire all the staff. The office manager was also retired at that point. They had to rehire everyone, and they'd run the clinic for another 2 years before they could sell it again. So these are certainly traps that the landlord has thrown into this type of section to cover their asset, their business, which is the location. They're making sure that their location and their building is as strong as possible, and they do that through the lease agreement. What that means for you, of course, is if this section is written poorly, it severely limits your ability to sell the clinic. It can limit your ability to buy the clinic as well. Of course, especially if you're buying a clinic, it can also seriously affect how much rent you're going to be paying over the next 5, 10, 15 years, your duration as a doctor at that clinic. Potentially, as a seller, it may keep you liable indefinitely. And unfortunately, for the buyer, when they want to sell, it's quite possible that they will also be liable after the fact as well. Not only that, but simply put, nobody wants to sell their clinic and be surprised by the landlord indicating they want a portion of their sale. So, you know, the cost of this particular line is tremendous. We want to make sure that this is looked after as much as possible when we're talking about the lease. Now, as far as what to do here, when you really get started, what I'm going to emphasize here is that, especially for those that are in a space today and they've got a lease and they're looking at all these clauses, you know, resist the temptation to go to the landlord tomorrow and say, you know what, Mr. Landlord, I went through a CE course earlier in the week and they suggested I rewrite the lease to make all these amendments much more friendly to you. Just hold your horses there. It's important to make sure that your timing is right because what I can emphasize to you is the greatest asset you have as a tenant, aside from being a vet, is time. It is when you approach. This is critical because the landlord, this is frankly, this particular section is written by a landlord, a major landlord in my area. It's right out of the landlord's playbook. They're thinking about this as well. If you are, let's say, 5 years early, your lease doesn't expire until 2032. Too early to discuss the lease, especially if you're just thinking about renewing, because there's really no obligation for the landlord to come to the table and talk. They've got you locked in for 5 years. The flip side is also true, where if you approach the landlord, let's say 1 month or a couple of months before your expiry, the landlord has all the cards. It's a lot more difficult to negotiate the lease at that point. Not to say it's impossible, certainly. We get a ton of doctors that forget about their option to renew. They simply don't renew in time. The lease is expiring. Maybe they just ran out of options to renew. Well, you still have a very significant opportunity to negotiate the lease. We do find there's a sweet spot here, and that's 12 to 24 months before your expiry date. The reason is if we approach 1 to 2 years, 12 to 24 months before the expiry, the landlord has to make a couple of decisions because what can happen is you as a tenant, if you decide to negotiate, that's fine. That's great. You have a lot more time to deal with the landlord. What we found is, especially with the bigger landlords, but of course with the mom and pop type of landlords as well, landlords can be very slow to respond to requests, to begin review. Perhaps it has to go to the legal department. They have to review any changes and so on. It has to go to accounting to verify that the business is cash flowing. Their building is cash flowing. So these things take time for the landlord. So it's important to have as much time for you to negotiate the lease as possible. Secondly, if we're approaching 1 to 2 years before the expiry, if you absolutely need to, theoretically, you could get up and leave. You need the time to find the new space. You need time to negotiate the lease, and you need time to build out the space and begin. 12 to 24 months is pretty much the sweet spot when it comes to that. Buying yourself time is critical here. So again, we want to make sure that you're approaching the negotiation with the right time frame in mind. So as I mentioned, we don't want to jump the gun and just ask the landlord for all the changes and negotiate all the rents. We want to tackle this in a number of steps, a strategic approach. The first step absolutely is let's make sure all your documentation is in order. I say this, I know I say this on every webinar, but it's absolutely critical to make sure that you know where your lease is. If you have a digital copy, make sure it's stored in a folder that you have easy access to. If it's paper, okay, no problem. Do not stick it in the bottom of the drawer. It's really important to note where it is and to make sure that you have every amendment, every extension, every assignment. If you have what we call an estoppel certificate, something the landlord hands to you to verify the lease, make sure you have that as well. Make sure you have every single document. Then, of course, the lease really needs to align with your goals for the clinic. So it's important to note for yourself to think about, well, where really do I want to take this ship? Do I want to expand? Do I want a second location? Am I happy where I'm at? Do I want to just renew the lease? Do I need any considerations when it comes to eventual transition? Am I gearing up for a transition? Am I going to take on an associate? Am I going to sell to my business partner? All these things need to be identified prior to reviewing what's in the office lease, reviewing what risks are associated, what's going to get in the way potentially of your plans. Then we'd want to look at all the market data. We'd want to take a look at, where everyone else's lease is sitting. How much are others are paying in the area? Are you getting a fair deal? Are you underpaying? Get an assessment of where you're at. Then, once we have that data, let's make a plan. Let's make the plan to go through, what we want out of this negotiation, where we're going to take the business, you know, what is acceptable, what's not acceptable for us to sign. Are we thinking about leaving? What's a plan B potentially? And you'll notice here that we've gone through 5 stages. What we've not done is we've not talked to the landlord yet. That's the next step. Once we've identified that you've got the correct documentation, you know your goals, you know what's in your lease today, you got an assessment of where you're at. You identify, okay, I'm happy with this, but I'm not going to be happy with this. Your overall goals and objectives. Then we can present an economic discussion and also a business cost discussion with the landlord. And we can go through the motions, do all the back and forth to see how they're behaving, where, how they're going to react, frankly, what's in the landlord's plans for the building as well. And then once you do all the back and forth, we get the final draft lease. It's quite important to review everything at the end as well. Simply put, we don't want you to sign whatever's in front of you. It's very important to go through the documentation and ensure that everything is consistent between what we talked about with the landlord compared to what we actually get. So as I mentioned, I'm the team lead at Cirrus Consulting. Happy to chat with anybody that has questions after the webinar as well. My contact information is below. We can certainly have a chat about your lease. And to answer the questions that were presented earlier in the webinar, one of the questions is, what advice can you give someone who is acquiring a practice in the lease space? Well, certainly there's a couple of things that come to mind. And the first thing is, do you have all the documentation? How many documents do you have? The second part is, once you've clarified that you have all the documentation, we need to determine, okay, what's your goal for taking over the space? Are you intent on leaving or staying? Or maybe you want to renovate the space after. We need to be able to review the documents after to determine, okay, well, if I'm renovating the space, what does the lease say about my ability to renovate the space? If I'm buying a clinic, what does the lease say about me transferring the lease from the selling doctor to me? That's going to be very significant. Also, it's obviously important is, when does the lease expire? Because if you only have 1 year left on the lease, you only have 1 year left to stay in a particular space. You have 1 year left to operate there. So it's absolutely vital to discuss potentially extending the term if you're intent on staying. That's going to be huge. Do you have the options to renew? If there are signs in the lease that allude to redevelopment, demolition clauses, well, that's going to be a significant factor to what you pay for a clinic, but it's also a significant factor as far as the viability of the clinic over the next 5, 10, 15 years. So we definitely want to take a look at all those. On top of that, the lease agreement, it binds you and binds your business to a particular space. So also relevant to look at is it's a little bit aside from the lease agreement, but it's important to look at the demographics of the area. What are the trends in the area? Is the area growing? Is it stagnant? Is it decreasing in population? What are the income levels? These are things that, aside from lease, they're important to note. You can certainly talk to your practice broker for more guidance regarding that, but that's certainly something worthwhile taking a look at. Also, quite commonly, when being assigned the lease, although you may be signing the lease with your vet corporation, the landlord may also ask you to sign the lease personally on top. Effectively, they're asking you to co-sign for your vet corp. So if something happens to the corporation, the landlord can pursue you personally for assets. Is it quite commonplace? Yes, definitely. Is it ideal? No, absolutely not. It's not ideal. Nobody wants to be personally liable if something were to occur. So that's something to also look at. Also important to look at, well, let's put it this way. The greatest predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So we can take a look at what happened in the past with the previous doctor. Were they liable on the lease? You know, how did the landlord um, leverage the selling doctor as far as the language of the lease? And so, these are certainly things that we want to take a look at. I'm also going to launch a poll here for the end of the webinar. And, thank you for the question. I'm open to answering any other questions here, if anyone has anything else to ask, if I haven't covered today. Or, if you prefer, you can always ask me personally after. I'll reach out to you after the webinar as well, and we can always have a chat. So, thank you, everyone, for attending the webinar today. I hope it was very informative, especially for those that, are thinking about leasing a space, trying to build out a space. Even if you're looking to renew your lease, very important to take a look at your lease agreement, get an assessment of what you're about to sign, because as I mentioned, you may be paying 1 or 2 or 3 million dollars for the clinic, but very important to note, you're also going to be paying 1 or 2 or 3 million dollars over the lifespan of the clinic, the duration that you'll be there for the lease. All right, everyone. Thank you again for spending the hour with me tonight. I appreciate everyone attending, and have a good night. Take care.